TNTRadio.live.
Online streaming.
Be a part of the conversation.
I stream it all at work, and I stream it to my phone and listen to it wherever I go.
TNT.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. We're still in the second hour here of this live broadcast. I want to welcome onto the program a great activist, also a great advocate for the Palestinian issue. Sarah Wilkinson's joining us right now on the live link. And among other things, Sarah's involved in the Freedom Flotilla. We've had guests on in the past, like Dr. Frank Romano, giving us some updates on that. I want to hear about the status of the Freedom Flotilla. But Sarah, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. I've seen how active you are, how busy you and your colleagues are to try to make a difference to improve this dire humanitarian situation that we're seeing right now unfolding in Gaza. Sarah, if you will, just give us kind of your summary right now of where the situation is at right now, starting with the Gaza Strip. Go ahead.
Well, it's in an absolutely dire condition, and famine has really taken hold, even though we were talking about it since November. Famine is disastrous in the north of Gaza. The mainstream media played down the numbers of people who were living in the north. We always knew there was more than 500,000. It's now, we believe there's nearly 800,000 Palestinian people living in the north with no access to any food whatsoever. So the state of famine there is at a crucial stage. In Rafah, there is more, obviously it's coming in on the black market. A lot of it, people are having to pay for water, despite it's meant to be aid. But people are a little bit better off in the south, despite the bombing campaigns. But in the north, they've almost been ignored, because we've had all eyes on Rafah, we've had all eyes on Deir al-Balah and on Almasi yesterday, when the Israelis bombed an area with about 100,000 tents in it. So the north of Gaza gets ignored, and yet it's a real hot spot of disease and famine, which is only going to get worse.
And Sarah, you know, the United States built this floating pontoon pier right at that point where northern Gaza and southern Gaza meet on the coast. They told the world this was for humanitarian aid for the Palestinian people, but it didn't turn out to be that, did it? It turned out to be something else. So considering that failure, what is the obvious solution in your opinion to remedy this situation?
Well, I don't think that was a failure. I think that we were calling it the Gaza death port because we always knew that it was never for humanitarian aid. But what it did do was bring in tanks and munitions and weapons and Israeli more troops and American militia that then created a massacre where 274 civilians were killed and 81 children. So actually the purpose it was built for was to bring things in. It was never to bring humanitarian aid. So it wasn't actually a failure. For them, it was a success. But as far as humanitarian aid concerned, it was a complete red herring. And we were trying to warn people, look, this is a death port. This is not built for the benefit of the Palestinians. This is built for the benefit of the Israelis. And then we had the Netzarim corridor and the tank belt built, and then a military barracks. And, you know, really what's going to happen is we're going to get Jared Kushner's waterfront properties built along that area once they've finished flattening Nusrat camp, which was always the next on the list, and then possibly Khan Yunis. So for them, it wasn't a failure. It was never meant to be there for that long. All it was there for was to bring stuff in and to take stuff out. But and even to force Palestinians into permanent exile. I don't think you'll see the return of that pier. So it was $31 million of American taxpayers' money purely to create a massacre, which is what it did. They may have rescued 4 hostages. They may have even brought them in, and they were never really hostages at all. It was an excuse, and a massacre came from it. So failure, success, it's kind of whichever way you want to look at it. As far as the Palestinians were concerned, it was a disaster. The answer is in, I mean, this is again, they've closed the Rafah crossing. This is another thing we were warning people was going to happen, is Rafah was going to be closed. And we were saying this for 3 months. So there were a lot of GoFundMe campaigns asking people to evacuate from Gaza, but we knew that Rafah was going to be closed. And then the next speculation was that they were going to destroy it so that it could never be operational again. And that has actually happened. They have now set fire to it, set it ablaze, then they've made it inoperable. So technically Rafah is closed. That could have brought in 5,000 aid trucks, which could have ended the famine, they're saying, in under 5 hours. If all of that food and medical aid was allowed into Gaza, into the south of Gaza, and allowed to travel up towards the north, famine could be over by now. So the whole destruction of Rafah, of closing it, of getting control of the Philadelphia corridor and getting another tank belt to divide Egypt from Gaza altogether, which puts Egypt out of the picture really altogether. So all of those aid trucks, some of the lorry drivers I spoke to, they said that they were turning around and going home with their loads still in their lorries. And some are staying there with the hope that Rafah will open again. But in my personal opinion, I don't think you will see Rafah open again. So the solution, what is the solution now? We are reliant on Erez and the Abu Salam crossing, Karem Abu Salam crossing, both Israeli controlled. So now we have to trust that what the Israelis do allow in the ruse of humanitarian aid is not contaminated, or is not the wrong type of food, or is not absolutely useless. I spoke to our colleague on the ground, Dr. Mohammed, who's running the Rebuild Gaza campaign to try and assist Palestinians and help not just medically treat them. He's also a surgeon. He's also a very qualified doctor, but he's also trying to get clean water to thousands of people. There is a network on the ground, and we obviously can't reveal the identities of all the people that are part of the Rebuild campaign. So we're asking people to donate to people who have no faces and no names, which actually is another problem. But eventually, and we're doing this by Bitcoin. So if people want to donate, they don't have to have a Bitcoin wallet. They can donate just ordinarily, and then it gets transferred into Bitcoin by other people, and then it goes straight to the network, the team on the ground. The problem being is the machinery and the equipment that is needed. Obviously, it's all very high prices, and it's all quite complex, and I'll try and keep it simple. But, they're trying to buy generators so that families, maybe 10 or 12 families, can actually use the generators to make their own water well, so that they can acquire their own drinkable water. Because basically these water tankers coming in, especially through the Israeli crossings, it's very expensive to buy a gallon of water, and people now have no money. But also they have very, very little strength. So you imagine like a 10-year-old child trying to carry a gallon of water 4 miles back to his family. So Dr. Mohammed, what he's trying to do is create a situation to make Palestinians more independent so that they've got access to drinkable water. And the reason that drinkable water is so important is because there's all sorts of rampant diseases. There's hepatitis A, which is a real problem at the moment. It is a treatable disease in any other normal environment, but where you have people who are in concentration camps and they can only drink contaminated water, and the food that they are getting hold of, it has a lot of fats and oils in, like they've been deep frying this animal fodder, is exactly what the liver cannot withstand. And hepatitis A, B, C, D, and E are all prevalent in Gaza at the moment. The only way to recover, apart from rest and recuperation, is clean water. The food that's coming in cans from, God knows where it's coming from, doesn't have Arabic writing on the side. So the fat content in the canned food, which apparently Dr. Mohammed tasted and spat out and said was absolutely disgusting, was not fit for human consumption. But if you're starving, then you're going to eat it. If you have hepatitis and you're eating canned meat with a very high fat content, which it possibly has, then you're going to exacerbate your condition, and your liver will just simply stop functioning. So it's absolutely integral now, because we can't forge a ceasefire. We can't get anything into Gaza. We can't get money into Gaza. The only thing we can do is try and get drinkable water to the Palestinians. And so this is what this Rebuild Gaza campaign is all about. It is absolutely vital to get clean water. And without it, people will die. And we've already seen about 45 child deaths. Now, that's a very, very low estimate. And it's mainly because there's no one left in Northern Gaza to collate the numbers of people who are dying from malnutrition. And sometimes they may die from a disease related to the famine. And so they may be listed as having died of the disease rather than the famine. But it's all hand in hand, and it's all part and parcel. And if you engineer a starvation campaign, which is what the Israelis are doing, which is another facet of genocide, then you create people with very, very low immunities who then get diseases that they can't recover from, and living in concentration camps in 38 degrees Celsius. In fact, the tents apparently are 40 degrees. You're spreading this disease, and you're turning what is an endemic into an epidemic.
Well, it sounds like speaking with people on the ground, you yourself have been on the periphery of this, I think on the Egyptian side. So you know exactly, what's going on with aid deliveries and so forth. So you've got your priorities, and everybody's agreed these are the priorities. You need fresh water. This is the basis of life. But we'll bring onto the screen here the latest news coming out of Tel Aviv and Washington is that Israel has engineered what they claim is a humanitarian pause. We'll bring that up on screen. This is the story that's basically dominating the headlines right now, right across all the Western media outlets in the United States and in Europe as well. This is how it's being portrayed, Sarah. Israel's army says it will pause fighting in order to help the flow of aid. So tell us, Sarah, from your point of view, what's really going on here?
Well, I've spoken to quite a few Palestinians from different areas, and they all say, what pause? They're still being bombed. These quadcopters are still shooting at people. They shot, I believe, in front of UNICEF chief James Elder. They shot at fishermen and killed 2 fishermen who said could have been lawyers in a past life, but they'd gone out fishing with a net to try and get some food from somewhere, and a tank appeared, and then these 2 guys were shot. He thought possibly there might have been a sign of life, so he asked permission to go and rescue them. He had paramedics with him, and the Israelis denied him access to save them. And eventually the family came and collected them with body bags, and one had been shot in the back and one shot in the neck. So we know that there is no humanitarian pause in the fighting. They've also been bombing areas today. And I think there's been, I think, 73 people injured. I'm not entirely sure what the death toll is, and maybe it's insensitive to talk about it in such a plain manner. But, there have been children and adults killed today. So if this is a humanitarian pause in the fighting, then, it's another Israeli lie. It's just another Israeli lie that's meant to deceive the world into thinking that they're doing the best for the Palestinians. What food they're taking in, a lot of it is useless. A lot of the flour is moldy. And I had some footage sent to me of canned food. Now, canned food actually does last in your cupboard for quite a long time, but when they opened this can, it was full of worms. So I can't tell you when the sell-by date was, probably 1923, but it was full of worms, And then another can, which was chickpeas, was full of these unidentifiable insects that were in the can and had obviously hatched inside the can. So this is inedible. I think Dr. Mohammed said that he was looking on the can somewhere. It was going to say not fit for human consumption because he said it was absolutely inedible. So this is what is coming through from the Karem Abu Salem crossing and down through the Erez. It's inedible food, and it's probably food that is of such high fat content that anybody with hepatitis A, and there are hundreds of people with hepatitis A, and it makes you very ill. I've had hepatitis, so the thought of not being able to regulate my diet or drink clean water, it's a killer. It turns a treatable disease into a killer, and it isn't just hepatitis A. Cholera is something that the World Health Organization should be monitoring. They should, be taking samples to a laboratory. They should be monitoring the onset of cholera. They're not in the north of Gaza. So I want to rename the World Health Organization to WHOEP, which is World Health Organization except Palestine, because their job is to monitor the rise of these diseases. And there's also things people are, again, to sort of question me on this. And it's mainly because names have been changed. There's leprosy. Leprosy never went away. What the Medical Association did is rename it as Hansen's disease. Now, Hansen's disease appears in the US. It appears in Africa, in Asia, in India. It's quite easy to catch when the sanitation and the hygiene and living in close quarters, and also the heat and soil contamination and dirty water, etc., 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 that actually the rise of these biblical diseases is quite it is probably the next step. But who's going to monitor that? Who is going to regulate it? And who is going to say, oh right, we have a septicemic plague, or we have, which is basically bubonic plague, and it's just another name for it. So you've got 13, 14 people living in a 40-degree-Celsius tent, plastic tent, right next to another family, right next to another family. And so you can see how these diseases are going to spread. Now, like some are spread by rodents, and we've got a rubbish problem, I suppose, for the Americans. A garbage problem is that waste, and human waste, is literally piling up on every street corner. So you are going to have a rodent problem. But then you've got another problem, is that there's no wood to burn. There's no wood to boil water for a long period of time. So it's easier to burn oil and to deep fry. And for people with hepatitis A, this is a killer. And for other diseases as well. It's extremely complex. So I'm really glad that the Rebuild Gaza campaign has a doctor who is the actual face of the campaign. The rest of the team, who are in the north and the south, also in central Gaza as well, they're all split in different places and can only communicate with each other by phone. They can't actually meet because they can't cross the Netzarim corridor. So this network of people, they are trying as hard as they can to find generators, which are in short supply and extraordinarily expensive, but also water containers, drinkable water, and getting water by horse and cart, and also by donkey and cart, to people who need it the most. But you're talking of 2 million people altogether across Gaza. So the sad part is that I think you have one doctor doing the job of 1,000 people, and you have about 10 other people doing the job of 100,000 people. And despite it can alleviate some of their suffering, if the bombing continues and the genocide continues, and people get more sick, then we may be up against a complete Goliath. And we just have to keep going. And you're asking people, it's from the goodwill of people, these donations, the money needed to buy these really expensive generators, and also the diesel or the cooking oil. Some of them can be run on cooking oil or petrol. It's an awful lot of money, and they're going to run out because nothing goes into Gaza. So eventually there'll be no generators to buy anymore. Eventually there will be no horses to pull the carts because the horses are also starving. There'll be no donkeys. And then eventually there'll be no firewood, and eventually, there'll be no drinkable water. So we're in a situation where nothing's going into Gaza. So we're up against the clock. We need people to donate very quickly because should the Israelis cut the telecommunications, then Bitcoin doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And so we can't transfer the donations into something that can then buy something that someone needs. So we're up against the clock. We're up against a genocide. We're unlikely to get a ceasefire. We're reliant on telecommunications, which is sporadic. And we are dealing with 2 million people who, this is not an endemic, this is an epidemic of diseases. But for the Palestinians, the only thing that we can do for them now is get them clean water. And this doctor is also providing a little bit of therapy. He's visiting children, amputees, who probably have no parents to visit them. So he's doing a doctor's job as well. And he's also on call at the European hospital. So if there's a bombing attack and injured people start coming in, he's on call as a surgeon as well. So this man probably works 25 hours a day or 8 days a week, as the phrase goes. But, it's an enormous task for one person, as I think he's the only doctor in the team. And it makes our job difficult as well. My colleague, Shameen Suleiman, she's probably on the phone for the same amount of time that he's working, making sure that everyone's connected, finding people who are very ill and need immediate attention. So he's got to drop everything. He's got to drop the water. He's got to forget that. And then he's got to become a doctor again. And it's an enormous campaign. So everyone's donations really are making a difference, but we can only retroactively show people where their money has gone. We can't tell people what's going to happen or where he's going to go for security reasons. So people have to wait and look at the the Twitter page, which is at RebuildGaza 0, and then eventually retroactively they'll see where their money has gone.
And I know the reality is, Sarah, and people should understand that you have to actually work through the black market, unfortunately, in these such situations. And so things aren't cheap. Even to build tents for families, extremely expensive materials are not easy to come by. So this is what you're up against. And, one of the other big lies, and it'd be great if you could clarify this too, because if there's people listening, they've heard different things. The lie in the media that I can see, and maybe you can speak to this, Sarah, is that they're blaming Egypt for aid not getting into Gaza. But if, from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, but Israel ultimately controls what goes in and out of Gaza, and they have complete control over that situation. But somehow everybody seems to be blaming Egypt, but that's not actually the case. Can you clarify this?
No, I think there's always been a lot of anger because people have seen, well, Rafah is in Egypt as well, and so it's down to the Egyptians. To be honest, when I was in Cairo, they wouldn't let me even pass the Suez Canal. So there is some I guess they are liaising with the Israeli regime a little bit. However, the Israelis have always controlled Rafah ever since the beginning of the genocide. That was one of the first things. So yes, and it was always the Israelis who would check over a lorry, find one item, and then turn the lorry away. So Egypt and the Egyptian people are doing a sterling job. However, really now Egypt is actually out of the picture. There's no point being angry with Egypt any longer. I do think Al-Sisi could have made a bigger effort. I do think that Egypt does bear some responsibility here, but I think when you're under the pressure, you're under US pressure, you're under pressure from various nations. If you do that, you're going to start a war. If you do that, we will not pay your national debt. If you do that, you're economically going to be struck into poverty for the rest of your days. So Egypt played a very bad game. And in the end, it could lose the Suez Canal anyway. If they did build the Ben Gurion Canal, that's goodbye to the Suez Canal. So I think Egypt didn't play a very good game. And there was a lot of anger. But now they're out the picture. The Israelis have destroyed Rafah border. And we did predict this. We said there's no way Rafah is ever going to open again. I do think the Israelis are after North Sinai. But I get criticized an awful lot for saying that. But there's 16 different military units from 16 different countries that are already in North Sinai. And so technically that area is already occupied, and it's already occupied by other countries. So to be honest with you, what I think with the Greater Israel project is that they want North Sinai. And so there's no need for Rafah crossing. They have Karem Abu Salem round the corner. So what is the need for Rafah? Technically, that went against Israeli interests. It gave the Palestinians a form of escape. It meant that if Egypt had been brave enough, it could have just piled those lorries into Gaza and ignored Israeli threats. So they didn't want Rafah. It was always a weakness. And if you're going to commit a genocide, you don't want an escape route. And so I think Rafah was an escape route. And well, obviously, it was the only escape route. And when they then built the Gaza death port, then we thought, right, Rafah is going. And so the only escape route then is going to be a platform that takes you into the ocean. And then you board a ship, and then you probably never reach your location. But then that takes you into permanent exile. But that wasn't the case either. So now the Israelis have complete control about what goes into Gaza and what goes out. And I can guarantee you nothing is going to come in that is going to prevent this famine, or it's going to solve the famine, because the Israelis aren't committing a genocide so they can save people's lives. They're committing a genocide because they're trying to exterminate an entire population. And you don't need to drop bombs on people if they're dying of famine, if they're dying of diseases that can't be treated, that there are no vaccines, there's no medical supplies, and those that are available still in Gaza, the price of them is huge. So I know that the third phase of the Rebuild Gaza campaign is to rehabilitate the European hospital in Khan Yunis, and to get medical supplies that are remaining in warehouses, and to restock that hospital so that Khan Yunis has a hospital of sorts. It's only partially damaged, but eventually everything is going to run out. There's no more airdrops. I think the Israelis have closed the airspace to Jordan. So nothing is going in. So eventually, if people need enough bandages, if people need enough insulin, all of this stuff will eventually run out, including the money, because the only thing that's happening with money in Gaza is it's going out to Israeli lorry drivers, or it's going out of Gaza, but nothing is coming in. People are having to pay for water that has been provided by an NGO as free water. So they're having to pay the drivers. So whether, the drivers are attached to the United Nations or UNRWA, or whether they're working independently, they're most likely Israelis. They're charging people for anything that's coming in. And eventually there's going to be no money. So even a bag of flour, and this is happening in the north, there is some flour in the north, but A, people don't have the strength to carry it because they're too weak. B, they've got to walk about 4 or 5 miles to collect it. C, it's moldy, or I don't know whether flour is inedible when it's moldy, but it's certainly not something that you would want to be using. And it may have been contaminated, may have been tampered with. I don't actually trust the Israeli regime not to, in some way, make the food that's coming in, contaminate it more. But that is, there's quite a big accusation. So I'll say that is my opinion. But I don't trust the humanitarian aid that's coming in from the Israelis. It's not coming in from Malaysia or Indonesia or Egypt or Jordan. It's actually Israeli aid. And this worries me greatly. So, and also the canned food that's inedible, the fact that all the sell-by dates are well past, are well gone, that the food is inedible. So that's what's coming in. So they're not doing this to save the lives of Palestinians. They're doing this because they're committing a genocide. So it's just another facet of genocide that they're going to starve them. Well, they don't want medicines to go in. They don't really want people to survive their wounds or for their wounds to not get infected. The fact that there's no anesthetic, the fact that, mothers can no longer breastfeed because they don't have any nutrition, they're not eating anything that allows them to breastfeed. It's all part of this, what I called a Rubik's cube of genocide. It's every single possible facet and formula and level and color formation that you can possibly think of. So no, I don't think anything going into Gaza is going to help the Palestinians. And I think that now Rafah is closed, that escape route, that one safety route is gone. We have to work for a ceasefire now because there is nothing else we can do. And that's probably the one thing that we won't get.
Yeah, it sounds like from what you're describing, Sarah, really there needs to be a definitive UN Security Council resolution to have a UN supplied aid going in there controlled by the UN with UN peacekeepers at Rafah. Israel's not going to be involved because you can't trust a country that's been bombing and killing a population on an industrial scale to be in charge of aid going in. It's just ridiculous at that point. So that kind of needs to happen immediately. And we hope that that pressure is going to build because it is do or die, as you say, Sarah. And the other, I don't mean to change to pivot here, but on the weapons side, this is another problem, is the U.S., the UK, and other countries are still supplying Israel, even though they're using their military to target civilians indiscriminately. They're still supplying. Now, in the UK, there's been activists have raided Elbit Systems in Kent, in southern England. We have footage from this. Was up on X. This has gone viral. Let's go ahead and roll this. I want to get your comment on this, Sarah. But if we have that clip, go ahead.
Where they make the tech eyewear for Israel to target the Palestinians. Well, we're not having it today. PCBs. This is expensive. Oh dear, terrible security. What were you thinking, Elbit?
So quite incredible scene. Now, activists have done sit-ins there. Elbit, the notorious British and Israeli defense contractor there. There's been efforts to shut the place down. Now we've seen this, which is they've broken in, and a major act of defiance here to shut down the war supply chain. Sarah, your thoughts?
Well, it's not the first time. Palestine Action are non-stop, really. They've managed in 3 years to actually permanently close 3 Israeli arms factories. So we did have 10. Now we have 7. And the amazing thing about Palestine Action is that it isn't 1 or 2 or 5 members. It's 100,000. It's people from all across the UK just sitting and waiting for their turn to move in. And so it's unstoppable. It's a grassroots movement. It's unstoppable. And there's no shortage of people that want to stop the Israeli weapons trade. Now, Rishi Sunak actually didn't admit that after October the 7th, and he was warned about how these weapons were being used, still issued 42 export licenses. And I can't remember, I think 9, maybe more, are what we call open licenses. So any type of munition can go can it be exported to the Israeli regime under that license? It doesn't have to be categorized. So we're still continuing to sell and host Israeli arms factories on our soil, despite knowing that these weapons, and we do know that these weapons are being used. I think Campaign Against the Arms Trade once tried to follow up and find out how many of our British drones, how many children had been killed in 2014 from drones that were made from Shenston, and came up with something like 143 children out of the 551 killed over 51 days were killed by British drones. So we know that this weaponry is being used to kill and maim the Palestinian people. And yet Rishi Sunak just refuses to set up a two-way arms embargo and just hands out the licenses like they were Christmas crackers, knowing that the weapons are going directly to enable a genocide. It's absolutely astonishing that he's defied the ICJ, really. He's defied the United Nations. He's defying all of the warnings, even from his own cabinet, and saying, look, these weapons are being used to kill and maim Palestinian civilians and children. And, you know, disproportionately is an underestimate. So at that point, when the assassination of the World Central Kitchen occurred, and two British, I think they were actually spies working for the Israeli regime, but nevertheless, they were two British personnel were assassinated, you would have thought at that point that the British government would have laid down a two-way arms embargo straight away. Our citizens are being killed, along with there was an Australian woman as well, and an American citizen as well. So at that point, that's when the two-way arms embargo, because I think I said in another interview, if the Israelis are going to say that was an accident, then we are selling weapons to absolute simpletons, bearing in mind that these drones can be operated by a 7-year-old. You know, it's like computer game stuff. And a lot of them are operated from outside the Israeli regime in places where anyone is unlikely to bomb, like Britain. So you can remotely control these drones in Britain and fire on Palestinians in Gaza, knowing that no one's going to bomb Britain, or no one would dare to bomb Britain. So it's an absolutely perfect place for dual passport Israelis to sit in weapons factories, controlling drones inside these impenetrable boxes, so that even if a bomb does drop on them, they're like the aeroplane black boxes, the materials that are indestructible. So from inside these places, in different weapons factories across the country, they are operating the drones. They are dropping bombs, they're dropping munitions, they're killing people, and they're using the UK to do it. So we are so complicit. But not only that, we're so invested in the weapons industry. Our MPs are actually invested in Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Elbit Systems. They're all invested in these weapons industries. So technically, the occupation they're making a killing, basically, out of the occupation. They're making a killing out of the genocide. So every time a bomb is dropped, you know, their share prices go up, and then they can pay for their fourth mortgage or whatever. So you're asking people who are invested in the weapons industry, in the Israeli weapons industry, to pull out when they're making huge amounts of money. So you're really up against, that's an incredibly difficult task. So the only way that it can be done is by preventing these Israeli arms factories from continuing to be able to produce the weapons. And the only way you can do that is to get inside the factories, is to make them inoperable. And that is what Palestine Action does. And it does it very well. They do a sterling job, and people sacrifice their liberty for the sake of shutting these places down. And some of them have been shut down for weeks, because once the air conditioning has been smashed off the side of the wall and half the roof has been taken off, then they can't continue to operate from that building. So yes, they've shut down 3. We have 7 to go. And there's no stopping Palestine Action. They're not going to go, oh, that's it, we've done enough now, we're going to pull out. Palestine Action are in it to the very end. They want every single Israeli arms factory gone from this country. Now, the truth of the matter is you're not going to stop the Israelis from producing weapons, but at least we won't be complicit. But the polymers and the British steel and the plastics and the wiring and all of that stuff, we make it too. So it's really cheap to make weapons on British soil. They have access to all these other factories that actually create, especially the polymers, you know, the casings for the drones and the munitions. We make them as well. We make just about everything, from the rotary for the helicopters to, you know, the motherboards for the whole, you know, so the whole thing works basically, and parts for tanks like air conditioning. And so everything is then reassembled in Haifa, and it's just shipped over to the Israeli regime. But for them to make all of these products themselves, they would have to import plastics that they can't make themselves. They'd have to import British steel and aluminium and tin and the wiring and all of this stuff, and they'd have a more expensive workforce. So basically they're operating cheaply in Britain with all the parts and components that they need to create weapons that kill civilians. That basically is the A to Z of it. And it's absolutely atrocious that we are allowing the Israelis to continue to do this. So yeah, Palestine action, unstoppable. And hopefully we'll have more to come from them very soon.
Sarah Wilkinson, Rebuild Gaza. We dropped the links on social media in the TNT chat community. We'll also re-air this interview segment as well on X tomorrow. But thank you very much for joining us, Sarah. I really appreciate you and the hard work that you and your colleagues are doing. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
There she goes, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Sarah, and also Malcolm, Shayuna, as well as Basil Valentine. Fantastic program today. Of course, we'll do it all again tomorrow. Stay with us for more TNT here on the live with State of the Nation coming up after the top of the hour news headlines.
TNTRadio.live.
Online streaming.
Be a part of the conversation.
I stream it all at work, and I stream it to my phone and listen to it wherever I go.
TNT.